The Congo dinosaur is still alive. What witness saw will haunt you. A fisherman named Abel never wanted to talk about the night he lost his brother. For 30 years, he kept the story locked behind his teeth, and when he finally told it to a visiting biologist, his hand was shaking so badly he had to set down his tea. He said the water near the bend in the river had gone quiet in a way water should never go quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. And then something rose beneath the canoe that was not a crocodile, and was not a hippo, and was not anything he had a word for in his own language. That single moment, one man, one river, one impossible silence, is where this story begins. Because somewhere in the flooded heart of Central Africa, in a swamp so vast and so dense that satellites can only see an unbroken green ceiling, people insist that something the size of an elephant with a neck like a serpent is still alive. Not a myth from a dusty book, not a campfire tale. A living animal that modern science says has been extinct for 66 million years. Stay with me through this one, because by the end you're going to have to decide for yourself whether you believe the witnesses or the textbooks, and I promise you that decision will not be easy. Deep in the Republic of the Congo, where the Sunga and Lukuala rivers spread out into a labyrinth of flooded forest, there is a wetland so enormous it would swallow entire small countries whole. It has no real roads. It has no reliable maps. Large stretches of it have never been walked by an outside human being, not because nobody has tried, but because the terrain itself refuses entry. The ground beneath your feet, if you can call it ground, is often a floating mat of decayed vegetation, thin as a rug, hiding black water underneath that has swallowed men whole. The water itself is the color of strong tea, stained by tannins from decomposing leaves, so dark that a paddle disappears the instant it slips beneath the surface. Pilots flying supply routes over the region describe looking down at what appears to be a single, seamless canopy, a green lid over an unknown world. From above, it looks peaceful. From inside a dugout canoe, according to everyone who has spent real time there, it feels like something else entirely. The people who live along these waterways, scattered in small communities separated by days of travel through channels few outsiders have ever crossed, have a name for what lives in the deepest pools. They rarely say it to strangers, and when they do, they lower their voices, the way you might when speaking about a disease that took someone you loved. The most common name translates roughly to the one that stops the rivers, a description of an animal so massive that when it moves through a channel, it visibly displaces the water and slows the current around it. Other communities, speaking different dialects across the same basin, use entirely different names. Yet when researchers have sat with elders and asked them to describe the animal behind the word, the descriptions line up with an unsettling precision. What they describe is not a dragon. It has no fire, no scales that glitter, no obvious theatrical menace. It is described as an animal roughly the size of an elephant or somewhat larger, low and heavy through the body, moving mostly through water rather than land. It has a long, thick neck, sometimes described as nearly as long as the rest of its body, ending in a small, almost delicate head. It has 4 sturdy legs, a long tail, and smooth grayish-brown skin the color of the river itself. And here is the detail that keeps surfacing again and again in independent accounts, the detail that a storyteller inventing a monster would almost never think to include. The animal is said to be a plant eater. It feeds on a specific riverside vine, certain fruits, and the tender inner stems of particular palms. Villagers have led visiting researchers directly to stripped, chewed plant stems along the riverbank as evidence, not of an attack, but of a feeding ground. That detail matters more than it might seem. Legends tend to grow teeth over time. A frightening story gets retold, and with each retelling the monster becomes hungrier, bloodier, more interested in human flesh. But this legend has resisted that pattern for generations. The people of the Lukuala do not claim the animal hunts them. They claim it avoids them, that it only attacks when a canoe strays into a stretch of water it considers its own, and even then the goal seems to be defense rather than predation. A myth built purely from fear usually escalates. This one has stayed remarkably restrained, which is exactly the kind of consistency you would expect from people describing something they have actually observed rather than something they invented to frighten their children. The scientific story of this creature does not begin with sensational headlines. It begins, somewhat improbably, with a careful, unglamorous professor of herpetology, a man who had spent his entire career training students to distrust anecdotes and demand hard evidence. He was, by every account, the last kind of person you would expect to organize an expedition chasing a cryptid. And that is precisely what makes his eventual interest so difficult to wave away. Something in the pattern of testimony convinced a man whose whole professional identity was built on skepticism to spend real time and real resources pushing into one of the most inhospitable environments on the planet. What he and later researchers did was not glamorous detective work, but it was rigorous. They traveled to villages separated by days of travel, by language, and by culture, communities with little to no contact with one another. To avoid leading the witnesses, they did not simply ask people to describe a legendary creature. Instead, they brought printed illustrations, dozens of them: elephants, gorillas, crocodiles, hippos, leopards, rhinoceroses, animals from Africa, and animals from entirely different continents, deliberately mixed together so no one could guess which picture the visitors were hoping to see chosen. And in village after village, separated by rivers few people crossed and languages that had little overlap, when the deck reached a particular illustration of a long-necked, small-headed, heavy-bodied animal, the reaction was startlingly consistent. Witnesses did not simply nod. Many corrected the image. The neck is longer than that, one would say. The tail drags lower in the water, another would insist. The skin is not that color. It is closer to the river itself. People who had never met one another, who spoke different dialects, who lived impossible distances apart along a hostile waterway, kept arguing with the same picture in the same direction. That is a genuinely strange thing for a legend to do. Myths drift. A story told and retold across distance tends to mutate, gaining details in one village and losing them in another, the way a rumor changes shape as it passes from person to person. What these researchers documented instead was convergence, not drift. The description held its shape across isolation, and independent correction toward the same specific details is not the kind of pattern folklore usually produces on its own. Consider, too, what the swamp itself contributes to this mystery. The natural objection anyone raises immediately is simple. If an animal like this existed, surely someone would have filmed it, captured it, or at the very least found unmistakable physical remains by now. That objection collapses somewhat when you actually understand the scale and hostility of this environment. This is one of the last genuinely underexplored regions left on the planet, a wetland so vast that entire stretches remain, by every honest account, unvisited by outside humans. There are no roads. Much of the land is floating vegetation over water that swallows light within inches of the surface. A helicopter would need to be directly overhead of an animal in a rare open clearing at the precise right second to capture anything on camera. In water that dark, something the size of an elephant could surface a few feet from a canoe and vanish again before human eyes even adjusted to what they were seeing. This is not a wide open lake where a long neck breaking the surface would be visible for miles. This is an environment that seems almost engineered by nature to keep secrets. Across more than 100 years, dozens of serious expeditions have pushed into this basin, some led by credentialed scientists, some by professional explorers who had genuine reputations to protect. None of them returned with a body. None of them returned with an undisputed photograph. What is striking is not that absence, but what they returned with instead. The same account, told back to them independently by people who had no possible way of knowing what the previous expedition had already been told. One naturalist who traveled into the region decades ago is a particularly telling case. He did not go in hoping to prove a legend true. By his own account, he expected to find a mundane explanation: a crocodile mistaken in poor light, an elephant crossing a river at dusk, a large snake glimpsed briefly and misremembered. That is exactly the kind of skepticism you want in a credible witness. He laid out his own set of mixed illustrations and asked people who lived on that water to simply point at what they knew. They did not point at the crocodile, an animal they clearly recognized and clearly feared for entirely different, more mundane reasons. They pointed again and again at the long-necked shape, insisting that was the animal that lived in the deep places, the one that did not tolerate canoes drifting too close. When he traveled elsewhere in the region and repeated the same exercise with people who could not possibly have coordinated with the first group, the same finger landed on the same picture. He went in expecting to close the case. He came out, by his own admission, with the case wider open than when he arrived. There is another story that circulates through the oral history of the region, one that elders return to again and again when asked why certain stretches of water are treated as forbidden. It is not a story of an attack on a person. Generations ago, according to the account, hunters finally cornered the animal in a narrows where the river pinched tight, killed it after losing patience with the fishing grounds it had claimed, and in the custom of the time, cooked and ate its flesh. Every person who ate it, the story goes, died shortly afterward. Whether that detail is meant literally or functions as a kind of cultural warning almost does not matter for our purposes here. What matters is the role it plays. It explains, within the belief system of the people who tell it, exactly why no specimen has ever been produced. It is not that a body cannot be found. It is that within their own logic, you do not touch this animal, you do not eat this animal, and you certainly do not brag about killing one. A culture that treats an animal as taboo is, almost by definition, a culture that will never hand a skeptical outsider the proof they are demanding. And still, reports have not stopped arriving through the decades. Missionaries who spent years living along these rivers have independently described being told, unprompted by multiple men in multiple separate villages, about an animal that surfaces briefly at dusk before slipping back under. Survey teams mapping timber routes have recorded local guides who flatly refuse to paddle past certain bends until well after sunrise, offering no explanation until pressed. There are second-hand reports of a low, resonant sound carrying across the water at night, a sound that local people who can identify virtually every animal call in their environment because their safety depends on it, insist belongs to nothing they can name. When people who can distinguish the exact register of a dozen different birds and the precise slap of a crocodile's tail tell you a sound does not match anything in their catalog, that is not casual superstition. That is the reaction of experts noticing something genuinely anomalous in a field they know intimately. Now, it would be irresponsible to lay all of this out without also walking through the ordinary explanations, because a fair investigation has to take them seriously rather than dismiss them for the sake of a better story. Start with the most obvious candidate, a large rhinoceros. Central Africa's recent past included both black and northern white rhinoceros populations, and a rhino swimming with its bulk mostly submerged and its horn breaking the water at an odd angle could plausibly startle an unfamiliar traveler. But this explanation collapses almost immediately against the testimony of the very people who live there. The indigenous communities of the region do not confuse these animals. They have separate, specific names for the rhinoceros and for the creature in the deep pools, and when shown mixed illustrations, they pass right over the rhino without hesitation and land on the long-necked shape instead. Rule it out. Consider the crocodile next. Genuinely stronger candidate. Nile crocodiles grow to lengths that are difficult to overstate, and a truly massive, old, individual glimpsed end on in poor light could plausibly read as something unfamiliar and enormous. But the crocodile is precisely the animal these communities know most intimately, the one responsible for real, tragic losses among their own families. They describe it with the specific weary familiarity of people who have grieved because of it, and they consistently describe the creature in question as something else entirely, an animal that avoids the same pools crocodiles prefer, with a long neck, a browsing diet, and a posture nothing like a reptile that hunts low and flat in the water. The proportions do not match. Rule it out on the specifics. Finally, Consider simple misperception, the most powerful skeptical explanation of all, and one that deserves genuine respect. People often see what centuries of storytelling have primed them to see. A floating log, a mat of vegetation, a swimming elephant with only its trunk breaking the surface. Any of these filtered through a lifetime of hearing the same name could plausibly become a monster in someone's memory. If this legend rested entirely on frightened villagers who grew up steeped in the story, this explanation alone might carry the whole case. But it struggles to explain the witnesses who are not primed at all, foreign travelers with no prior knowledge of the legend who nonetheless describe the same shape, or trained researchers who arrived specifically intending to debunk the story and left instead feeling genuinely unsettled. Misperception, when it happens across a population, tends to scatter into many different imagined shapes rather than converge on one consistent silhouette. This case shows convergence, not scatter, and that difference matters. So where does that leave us? Every tidy, monster-free explanation fails on specific, testable grounds rather than on faith alone. And what remains standing uncomfortably is testimony pointing towards something genuinely unidentified, an aquatic animal with reptilian characteristics living within a wetland large and hostile enough to hide a small population indefinitely without ever surrendering a body to the outside world. But here is the honest, necessary caveat, the one any responsible telling of this story has to include. An unidentified animal is not the same thing as a proven one. Everything gathered here is testimony, consistent and hard to dismiss, but testimony all the same. There is no verified bone. There is no verified carcass. There is no photograph that has survived serious scrutiny. The consistency of the witness accounts is remarkable, and the environment is close to a perfect hiding place. But a vault that has never once been opened is also a vault we genuinely cannot see inside of. Nothing here should be mistaken for confirmed scientific fact. It remains, honestly and accurately, an open question, a documented legend backed by a genuinely unusual pattern of eyewitness consistency, not a settled discovery. What we can say is that the region is changing quickly. Logging roads are pushing further into the basin every year. Shifting water levels linked to broader climate patterns are draining some channels while flooding others, forcing whatever does live in those deep pools, animal or otherwise, to move in ways it has not had to before. More outside eyes are reaching places that were never reached before, and that means the next credible account may not come from a river guide passing down oral history. It may come from a research camera left running on a bank no human being has stood on in 1,000 years. So I will leave the final judgment to you, the way this story has always deserved to be left. Weigh the pattern of correction across isolated communities who kept arguing with the same picture. Weigh the sound with no known source in a place where people know every other sound by heart. Weigh the crocodiles that avoid certain pools entirely. Weigh the shape that refuses to change across 1,000 miles of rivers that barely speak to one another. And then tell me honestly which single detail you cannot quite explain away. Because whatever you decide, one thing is clear. Somewhere in that dark green heart of Africa, something is still out there that nobody has managed to fully explain. And until someone does, the legend of the Congo's living dinosaur is not going away.